Let's have a look at how we went from this to this in just 1 week during the Brackey's 2023.2 Game Jam. A heads up, if you want to play the game before seeing the process, there's a link in the description. No need to download, it works in the browser. My 2 artist friends who have done my 2 previous game jams with were busy this week, so I was expecting to have to do everything myself. I was dreading this since I'm no artist. I've been fascinated with procedural generation since I first saw the trailer for No Man's Sky, but I've never tried to use it. I was really hoping the jam theme would facilitate something like this. Diving deeper was good enough, so I decided, we're gonna go down procedural levels and choose something, and then I got started. No concept or anything yet. Now for me, the lesson in this jam was to rest and take breaks. I spent so much time fixing bugs that were either really simple or just caused by myself because I was overworked and I just couldn't see the problem, or I just couldn't see a greater than sign that should have been a smaller than. For me, the jam started at 1 PM and I got to coding at about 7:30 the first day. So it's not a full day, maybe like 5 or 6 hours. I started with level generation. I wrote a class to generate positions with a random walk algorithm. If you're not familiar, it's exactly what it sounds like. The algorithm takes one step in a given random direction for a desired amount of steps, and then you can repeat the process. By adjusting where and how the walk starts and where it's allowed to go, you can get different results. I used a hash set, which is a data structure like an array or a list or a queue, but it has the specialty where it doesn't accept duplicates. Let's say you want to add the location 5.5 into a list during a random walk. Then you do another walk which passes through 5.5, and now the list has list positions index 0, 5.5, and index 1, 5.5. So spawning game object with this list would give you 2 objects in the same location, whereas a hash set just says nope. So if your random walk is allowed to go back and forth, a hash set will save you from having to check if the location already exists. A hash set has some limitations, which sadly gave me trouble later. Next, I made a level builder that would take the position data and place tiles and later other objects and enemies based on the data provided by the level data generator. Before long, I had a working prototype. I decided to make a custom inspector to test the level generation more easily. I just couldn't remember the syntax for this, so this took me some googling and looked back at my old code as well as some trial and error. This only took me like an hour and a half to get it to this point. If I set this walk count to 1, you can see like that's what a single random walk looks like, because it can go back and forth. So because you set it at 10 doesn't mean you get 10 tiles. And then if you set it like 100, then you get like this really long path. And if you just set the walk count to 100, and you start getting these kind of islands. Maybe if you punch some holes in the middle. Yeah, seems to be working. The visual and the collider of a tile are separated, so I could create some visual interest by offsetting the model of the tile but keeping the collider in place, ending up in a completely smooth floor which looks like it's made out of slabs. I was starting to think that this looked kind of like an ancient temple, and remember I had absolutely no thematic concept or the game yet. Next, some pretty basic player movement. I struggled to implement camera relative movement since I wanted this isometric kind of view for the game, and forward Z is diagonal up in this context. I did figure out you have to use the camera's forward vector as the movement direction, but that causes the character to go to and from the camera center. I tried projecting the movement vector to a plane, I tried rotating it, but it was just a mess. And I felt really stupid after IHeartGameDev's code just showed me that, oh, you just have to zero out the Y component, and that was it. Now it worked. I'd gotten this far in just 5 or 6 hours. I was feeling pretty confident I could pull this off, so I ended day 1. I started with a Cinemachine follow camera and getting the character to look at the mouse. Same code I did in the GMTK jam where I raycast to a plane, so I'm not dependent on any colliders to act as a target for the raycast. Same thing here with the movement, you just have to set the Y value manually so the player looks directly in front of him and not at his feet. Then I got started on a basic enemy. I used the same movement code that the player has, and I coded an enemy brain class to give the movement class an input vector, and I got it working really fast. And then I just implemented a stopping distance. The enemy would completely ignore gaps, so I did a raycast to check that there's ground directly in front of them. You could still trick them to fall if you got them to walk diagonally, but for a game jam I thought this was good enough. A simple health system to be shared between the player and enemies, and any indestructible object I maybe could add later. And then I was off to work on being able to shoot enemies. This was one of those moments where I could see that coding for 7 hours straight without eating or taking a break is just not a good idea. I just couldn't for the life of me get this right. I mean, it's a raycast, it's not complicated, but after I just had lunch and a break, I fixed it in like 2 minutes. Pew pew pew, 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 pew pew. I implemented a player spawner that would place the player on a random tile at the beginning of a round. Later I would make this a bit more intricate, so there's actually a dropping sequence for the player to create the illusion of going down, while in reality it's just the exact same Unity scene, just with regenerated level and enemies. Next was enemy spawning, and with shooting, spawning, and level generation I had the workings of a game loop. I made the enemy spawner keep track of all enemies and call the level to regenerate itself when they're all gone. I noticed that if an enemy fell off the map, that would break the entire system, so I made them die if they fall. Initially I was thinking about adding walls, but I thought that making enemies fall off the map was actually kind of fun. After some bug fixing, I made a tile that would regenerate the level if you stepped on it after all enemies were killed. I gave the player a melee strike that would push back enemies, but do less damage than a bullet. Essentially it works the exact same way as shooting, but with limited range and a different animation. It took me forever some reason to get that streak animation to work properly. I couldn't tell you why, it's just the lack of rest and nutrition. Remember to take breaks, people. I spent a moment trying to find the visual feel of the game, and then my 3D artist friend got back to me and said that she could have some time to participate and is there something that she could do? And I said, characters. I can do some hard surface stuff, but concepting and executing a character is way beyond my art skills. She initially started working on a minor character, but she had the idea that that's kind of boring, like what if the character could be something a bit more interesting? So she made this sketch for a cat character, and I thought, okay, I was thinking the level could be a temple, she thought the character could be a cat, okay, so cats plus temple equals Egypt. Okay, so the enemies could be mummified cats. I implemented another enemy, which is a ranged enemy. The enemies work almost similarly, they just have one script which is different, and that's the attack behavior. They walk to a stopping distance and then execute an attack, melee or ranged. At this point I noticed that I often got stuck testing the game just because it was kind of fun to play. Now considering this was only the end of day 2, I was feeling pretty good about the game, so last thing I did was look through a sound library. I brought on Humble Bundle for some weapon sounds, and I implemented those to be played randomly from an array with a slight pitch variation each time so it doesn't sound repetitive. I also added a spotlight to the character that turns on for a split second when you click the mouse to add like a muzzle flash. The morning started with giving the ammo pickups I'd made yesterday evening some juice by having them bounce when they spawn. I started with a physics-based approach, but quickly scrapped that and made a coroutine that does a Bezier curve in the air and lands the pickup at a random spot around the spawn point. I had to go record a podcast, and when I came back the afternoon was spent downloading some Unity starter particle assets and giving the shooting a bit more juice. In the final game the effect is maybe a bit too subtle. I gave the enemies the same melee script as the player, and now they can kill you. I copied the damage overlay from my previous Jan game for visual feedback when you get hit. Enemies were still being spawned on top of each other, so I made the spawner keep track of each used position. This was one of the problems I had with the hash set. You can't get an item with a random index from a hash set. So I had to keep 2 lists, one hash set and one list. If this wasn't a game jam, I would have perhaps refactored the code. I also made it so enemies are not allowed to move for the first couple of seconds during a level, so you have a moment to orient yourself. Then I started working on the thing that will actually fulfill the theme of diving deeper, so that the player keeps going down levels instead of just appearing on a new level. First, I made the hatch open. It's not an animation, but it's a coroutine and an animation curve that does sort of a bounce. And then I moved the level end trigger area below the hatch tiles so you hit it when you fall down and it regenerates the level. I had a problem with the Cinemachine follow camera as it would transition smoothly between positions. The camera isn't actually following the player, but an invisible object that is following the player. This is just so I have more control over the camera. I had to disable and re-enable the following behavior on level switching, and also set the camera's dampening to 0 until the sequence was complete to hide the transition. I couldn't get rid of the last flashing frames, so I used some code from the damage indicator to use an overlay to hide the first few frames of the camera snapping in place. Now remember, just because a game developer says I added something, doesn't mean it worked first try. I mean, nobody's perfect, everybody makes mistakes, and almost nobody gets a first implementation right on the first try. I noticed there's a bug in the game where you can land on an enemy and push them off to the side. I just thought it was so funny and I never fixed it. It's now a feature. I thought it was kind of fun that enemies fall down, so I did some voice acting and I compared my voice acting to an actual angry cat, and I kind of preferred myself, so I added this meow sound when enemies fall off the map. At some point during the day I apparently added camera shake with Cinemachine. It's so simple to make, I barely remember doing it. At the end of day 3 I thought I had all the necessary systems in place to qualify for the jam. Last thing was trying out some colors and lighting for a more temple kind of look, and then off to watch Netflix and sleep. Day 4 was Blender Day. Since I had a semi-functioning game loop, I decided to make some art. Since my friend helped me with the characters, that would leave environment art to me. I made a simple tile and I tried to make a procedural sandstone texture for it, just because I thought it would be fun to make stuff from scratch, so not everything would be an asset. So this took me a while since I'm no expert at Blender, but I think it turned out alright. Perhaps a bit too realistic compared to what the characters ended up looking like, but like I said, I'm no artist. And then I made some variations of the tile, 5 to be exact, and in the game, when they're placed, they rotate randomly in 90-degree increments to add some more visual variation. In hindsight, this effect is so subtle you can barely see it, but maybe if it wasn't there, the repetition would bother you. So perhaps this was worth the 2 hours it took me to make and implement them. I added some sound effects and visual effects to the level start and end sequences, which I didn't record, but they're just modified versions of Unity's free particle pack. I changed some colors and materials and scale. Then I made the hatch, and again, procedural texture and some variations. Something you don't pay attention to, but maybe you would if it wasn't there. Now, since I knew the character was gonna be wearing a miner's helmet, I gave him a light, and while I was on a roll, I made a bullet model for the ammo drop. The health drop I just made with Unity cubes. Since the enemy movement makes them bunch up since they just make a beeline for the player, I wanted to do something that could blow up, so I made this stone pedestal with a rolling plane on top to act as liquid. The material is just the sandstone normal map with a red color and then it rotates. I made a warning particle system and edited an explosion sound for it. Close to midnight at the end of day 4 I got the T-posing grave robber cat, so I added him just for the loots. Since the model for the cat was called Hero Cat, but he's a grave robber, I thought that, okay, I'm getting this really colonialist vibe, so I thought I was gonna lean into that. I've been thinking that it's kind of fun that the projectile enemies just push you around so you can fall, and when I saw the cat character, it occurred to me that if they shoot water, it makes sense that it doesn't damage you, but it makes you fly, as you know, cats hate water. Originally, I had intended for the dungeon to have walls, but like I said, pushing enemies off the sides was an idea that just came to me while testing, so I ran with it. I added some Creative Commons music tracks from pixabay.com and I called it a day. The morning started with implementing animations. I had never worked with plane trees before, and if you've used Unity, you know the animator component is powerful, but it can be ridiculously complex. Since the character can look in any direction while moving in any other direction, I needed to know the difference between the moving direction and the facing direction to blend correctly between walk cycles, back, forward, left and right. This was quite easy by getting the dot product between the facing direction and the movement direction. If you don't know, a dot product is a float value that is positive if two vectors are pointing the same way, and it's negative if they're pointing completely in opposite directions, and it goes to 0 in between. It did take me some time to realize I also had to multiply those vectors with the camera forward, as the raw input vector from Unity points diagonally up and to the right on the game screen and not away from the camera. But feeling confident I could pull off my very first animation blend tree, I took a break and headed to the gym. When I came back, I implemented animation blending and it worked fine. This took me a couple of hours in total, and it's subtle. You can barely tell that it's there, but again, maybe you'd notice if it wasn't there. I felt it was about time our grave robber got his pickaxe, so I modeled one. I used the same wood and metal textures I had before I used for the bullet and the hatch. The animations are humanoid animations from Mixamo.com, and since he has a big head, he was swinging his pickaxe through his head, so that required some manual tweaking. I received the model for the ranged enemy and added that. I also made him float around with some sine wave offset in X, Y, and Z coordinates. Then I added a way to pause the game and a placeholder pause menu. Since I was doing pretty good on time, I wanted to make a proper tutorial and not just a text screen. I came up with the idea of using in-game signs to show the player basic controls. These are just made with Unity cubes and the wood material I made for the hatch. The sign's content is just a picture I made in Photoshop with transparency. I thought I'd make the end of the tutorial door a temple, which I started modeling, but then I realized it'd be better for the tutorial to end the same way every level does. That way the player is taught that jumping into the hatch is what they're supposed to do. The sand texture is a free material from textures.com. I started the day by making pillars for the tutorial level, so I'd have some reason to contain the player in the tutorial zone. It's just a modified version of the sandstone texture I made, and the glyphs are a font that I added to the bump map and baked out the normal map. Just says Lorem ipsum doloresit amet with images of birds. I started work on the first draft of the main menu. It's just game object with forced perspective. The enemy is actually right beside the player character. I yoinked the audio settings menu from a previous project. I wanted to add some juice to the combat, so I decided on simple damage flash effect for the enemies, works every time. The first draft of switching the material to a pure white seemed kinda meh, so with some googling I actually found out that you can affect the emission of a shader in Unity by accessing the shader's properties with these string references. By the way, if you want to use HDR or emissive colors in your serialized fields, you can do so with this attribute, color usage, true, true. They stand for show alpha and HDR. After I got the basics working, I made some settings to be able to control the length and number of flashes. And as we were working on game feel, I thought it was time for the enemies to properly die, not just disappear. So I made them disable movement and allow rotations to the rigid body, as well as add some directional force when they die away from the player. It's always away from the player, so if you can actually tell that when they die of an explosion, they'll still fall away from the player, not the explosion. I also looked back at my voice acting to add some meows when they get hurt. I made a script to wag the tail of the range enemies. Again, it's just a detail that you would probably only notice if it wasn't there. I made an end screen where you can restart the level or quit the main menu. I had serious problems with events not unsubscribing, which caused a ton of null reference acceptance, which again would have been easy to fix had I not been malnourished and overworked. So remember to take breaks, people, I really mean it. But after that, I had a functioning game, so I built it and uploaded it. Even though I had a functioning build a full day before the deadline, I was still feeling kind of stressed because I really wanted to add collectible treasures, a third enemy type, a score counter and a score screen, and I didn't have a full day to work on it the next day, and the day after that would be the deadline, and I only had 3 or 4 hours on that day. But you can only do your best, right? Second to last day, I'd had shooting in the game since day 1, but our character still didn't have a gun, so I modeled a revolver. It needed to be detailed enough to look okay in the starting menu, but I used the same one for the actual player character, and it's unnecessarily complex and detailed for a small prop that's only seen at that distance, but it was faster to just make one. For some unknown reason, applying animations to the mummy character received that day didn't go as smoothly as the player. I don't know why, because I'm not that familiar with rigged 3D animations and how they work in Unity, but I was getting stressed and frustrated since I wanted to add much more stuff, and this literally took me hours of starting again from scratch, and I still couldn't get it to work, and I don't remember how I actually got it to work. You may have noticed that the enemies have this slash trail animation, same as the player, for most of the week, but it's gone in the final game, and this is the reason. I just couldn't get it to work after I fixed everything else, and I was too stressed to keep trying. I had plans for the evening, so that's everything I got done that day. I still uploaded another updated build just to feel safe, and I didn't get to add almost anything I still wanted to add. I think I got the score counting screen implemented on this day, but I have no footage of it. A testament that I was feeling a bit stressed even though I had a functioning build uploaded. But I was feeling ambitious since I think the game felt really good. My other friend, who I've done jams with, came online on Discord and said, is there something he could do? And I would say, yes, please. We need some UI design. And he made all the UI. It took him like, I don't know, an hour and something. I could have never done this. The UI looks so much better with his work on it. Day 8, and only a few hours until the deadline. I prioritized adding a third enemy rather than collectible treasures, as the game loop is mostly combat, so I think an enemy is more important content. It was easy to make as I just switched some settings, the model and the texture, as well as the projectile from the other ranged enemy. However, I kept making mistakes, so I actually ended up rebuilding both ranged enemies twice. It's just stupid mistakes where I just would override changes to another prefab over and over again, so it took me longer than it should have. Like here, where the ranged enemy is shooting itself out of its own mouth. After that, I had about 40 minutes left until the deadline. No time to implement treasures, so I made 2 builds, a WebGL and a downloadable, and I went to have some brownies I bought myself as a reward for finishing the game. Since I had the whole week free to work on this, I think it turned out really well in my opinion. Based on the feedback from people who played it during the jam, it's a bit too fast-paced for someone trying it for the first time. For me, it's easy to control, but I've been playing it for an entire week. Also, the knockback, which I thought was hilarious, it feels like a bug to most people when you get flown up into the air. Like I said, I found myself spending a bit too much time testing. I just got stuck on the basic combat loop, which I think it means that it's actually kind of fun to play. I'm no artist, but I think I did okay with the environment art that I made. And as of releasing this video, I still haven't gotten the results of the jam, but I really hope people liked it. You can give it a try.